welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be drawing a praying mantis. As always, I'm using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Alright, so we have a praying mantis here. It's a cute little guy. Now their faces are relatively flat-ish, so I'm not going to do my normal step of sketching it in. I feel like I can do all of that while I'm drawing it out. Because of that, I'm going to go ahead and decide that the light source is above and to the right. As always, that means above and in front of, not behind or next to. So it's kind of, roughly here. It's got some, and different praying mantises, change a bit, but I'm going to have some yellow stripes coming down its face, yellow bridging the edge, and then green everywhere else except its little dupers here. Tentacles? I don't know what they are. Mouth? Tentacles? Mouth? I don't know. And those are going to be like a light brown, and then his eyes, I'm still debating whether or not to do those in green or to do them in brown. Was kind of a green ridge. But first we're going to start with the yellow. So that, most of the yellow, at least the stripes down his face, are going to be full pin pressure, because this will be in full highlight. Now I have to be mindful, even though I'm doing this, and I'm skipping that sketching step, how I want the lines to go, or I will create line conflicts for myself. So it's easy to say, oh look, they bend a little bit, let's follow that. But I need to make sure that I'm not necessarily doing that. So we're going to have the lines going straight up or down so that it blends nicely once we get into the green for the rest of his face. All right, and then we'll bring these down. It should work nicely with the vibrant green that they have as well. Bring that down. Right, and it's a little knobby, so they don't have to be perfectly straight because they're not. Which is also kind of nice, makes that a little easier. It's going to be a little harder on the edge of the face, potentially the eyes, especially if I do the eyes the way that I want to do the eyes, which is kind of how we do bee eyes, where you're doing stripes. That might make the edges a little harsher, but we'll see how that goes. I might change my mind, but I think that would add a nice detail. So again, this one as well. We're just bringing that down, full pin pressure. Don't worry about shadows yet. We will once we get over here. We don't have to do that yet. And then we have these guys. Oh, see, natural. You want to turn the brush. Probably wouldn't affect anything, but trying to be mindful. Because if I follow it in one place, I'll likely follow it in another. It's the danger of it. I thought about drawing the full body of a praying mantis, but I think the head is still identifiable, right? Like, we still look at it and we're like, oh yeah, that's a praying mantis. They're such interesting animals. Insects. They're such interesting insects. Alright, so just like before, bringing it down, making sure there's no weird gaps, because I am doing full pin pressure, so I'm not even doing the sketching step I usually have underneath. That may create a little bit more in terms of gaps. It'll be easier. One of the reasons I'm doing the yellow first is so I don't get myself confused. The green has so much surface area, I might, get my lines twisted, basically. Confused over what's what, and I don't want to do that. And so to avoid that, I'm doing the yellow first. Right, so as we pop that off, we have some nice bright yellow bars. Now we have 3 coming down here, and then we're going to have yellow on the edges. So these 3 will also be in full pin pressure, but the edges down here on the sides of the face won't be. That's when we're going to start transitioning. So we have, and they're kind of not fully connected. See, I didn't do a good job of sketching out what I was doing here. And I'm twisting it, so I need to be careful once again. I'm not doing that. And I'm pulling this a little bit more straight down. It's easy to want to follow the lines of the sketch instead of the lines that I should be following. Same thing over here. We have You can do it a little bit without messing up. And I don't know, because it's an individual sort of segment, it might not matter, but I know I've run into line conflicts enough. It's something I'm a little bit more careful with. Right, so we'll bring this down. And then we have some dots down here, and we have this guy up here. See, it's a natural tendency to try and twist it to follow, which is fine and all. However, as long as it blends, it doesn't matter. And then straight down, that's nice and easy, relatively straightforward. Again, luckily it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. That makes it easier. I don't have to go in and erase constant little splotches, but you do have to be mindful, right? I have a strip here where it's clearly a brighter yellow, so just to make sure I don't leave that in place. All right, and then we have these guys, and then we'll get into the side of the face and talk about some of the shadowing. And the other good thing, right, it's not perfectly symmetrical. They're not identical on one side and the other, because that can make it harder too. Okay, it's a good start. Pop that off. We have a nice interesting pattern going up his face. Okay, now we have obviously yellow here, but this is going to be in shadow, so this is significantly backed off pin pressure, and it's going to run into the tentacle, and it is on the back side of where we decided on the light source, right? So I'm going to do this in shadow, and then we're going to readjust just a little bit, partly because you don't want, sorry, there was a big gap as I gather my thoughts. You don't want a color change to happen in a light and shadow change. It might be far enough over. There would be some shadowing that would be naturally happening here, but I feel like you'd be getting some highlighting here, right? That would be transitioning into shadow after that. So then the transition is actually happening, see, here in the yellow. Likewise on this side, you know, all edges are in shadow, even the edge on the side of the light source. You can see as I bring that down, I'm readjusting my angle so that I'm hitting that edge, hitting it out instead of following that line. I think it's okay to bring in the lines, right? Bring in and then bring them down, because you have this face squishing in, so that shouldn't create any line conflicts. But once again, I'm going to do this whole segment in shadow, and then we'll add the highlight in, which needs to be a bit more prominent than it was on the other side. Right, this comes down. So highlight, you know, this is all definitively still highlight. Now I'm not putting more pin pressure, I'm putting more strokes, because more pin pressure actually will complicate things. Brighten it up too much. We don't want that to happen. But adding more strokes does the same thing. And then just bringing it to the edge. Not all the way over, but not as bright. And if we need to, we can brighten this up so that it looks like that's going into shadow, right? So if we take that off, yeah. Okay, so then we have this section down here. We're going to bring the line straight down. Being mindful of the edge. Still bringing it straight down. Still being mindful of the edge. Doing it in shadow. But we will be adding some highlight to this as well. So this is backed off pin pressure. And I think I forgot to say it at the beginning, but if you're setting this up, I always set it up on a 15 by 18 Typically I'm thinking of drawing on t-shirts, so that's kind of my standard size. And I do it with my pixel size, the hard round brush selected, which you can actually see over here, set to a pixel size or a size of 15, right? So you select the size, you can kind of see that up here. So we have the edge of his mouth, going into more tentacles, right? This should make it interestingly easier because the little, I keep calling them tentacles, I don't actually know what they're called. These little dupers are, it's okay to change their direction. Right, so then we have more of the mouth coming here underneath. I'm going to change the shape from what I drew though. Still light pen pressure. Giving a little bit of a swoop up. Okay. Yeah. See, this side's blocked by the thing. Okay. Now, for some highlighting, certainly have some over here. Probably all the way down into the arm. So we'll need to determine exactly where that transition is happening. Right, so I'm going to put a little bit, I'm going to put more lines and maybe a little bit more pin pressure, but not a lot through here, because I want to brighten this up. I just need to determine where my light source would be shifting to know how far down to bring this. Make sure that all blends together. And then transition down into shadow. You can brighten up the top. Oh, that was too much. Overzealous swipe down. And the same thing on this side. Right, now we're into that area. This would be getting highlight and just fade it off. Okay. And we're going to get the green. So it's got that interesting, you know, they have that interesting green about them. There will be some shadowing on the back side of this antenna, right? I'm going to go ahead and get this in just a bit. So you're going to have some shadowing. I'm going to change kind of the direction of how this is going to indicate hills and valleys, bumps and things all the way down, right? So you'd have shadowing affecting the entire back side of that antenna and some shadowing underneath. But all edges are in shadow, so there would also be some shadowing on the front side of the antenna. And then we'll do some highlights in the middle, right? And then if the light source is coming from above and to the right, there's going to be some shadowing at the base where the head meets the antenna, kind of behind it. Depends on the angle of the light source, how extreme that is. So if it's here, right, you have a light source here shining down, it's going to push a shadow kind of in that direction. So kind of in this direction, right? So we're going to have this come up and then narrow out where you have that little bit of antenna going, and then that antenna changes direction, so we need to as well, and pull that all the way to the edge, and then do the same thing on this one, right? So might as well just do the whole thing in shadow. It's going to be the easiest thing to do, because they're not very big. You're not working with a big space, and that can make it tricky. So light pen pressure, full thing in shadow. I didn't over there because I didn't do the full base, but it's easy enough to do. And then the same thing where you have the shadow coming off the back. You want it coming off at the same angle. But then that antenna comes off at a different angle, right? It's coming off to the right. So we'll have that coming up. And then, again, all edges are in shadow, so the whole head, top of the head here, is in shadow. Right, so that's that light pin pressure all the way over. Foreheads tend to have the most highlight because they are the closest to the light source. And there's very little blocking, forehead typically. In this case, we have, antennas sticking up. That certainly blocks it, but usually they would be the brightest because of nothing to interfere with their brightness. Alright, so we have middle point, right, pulling that down. And then as we blend this back in, we'll have to be mindful too. Luckily, it's okay if we're a little bit off. They're kind of strangely bumpy. There's also a few little pieces of hair which I have coming up, interestingly, with a praying mantis. Right, I do like to check edges, so I'll often pop that off. I think that looks fine. You're not quite getting the praying mantis yet, but all the edges are actually done, so that's interesting. So then that should be, for the most part, it. There's a few bumps and things, right? So we have a few lines and other things. So I'm just going to do a little bit of shadowing where we have these bumps kind of delineating spaces on their faces. Yeah, that kind of rhymed. I don't know why that's exciting, but it is to me. It's fun. Same over here. We have kind of this dip down, so I'm going to create a little bit of a shadow. And then you have that dip, a little bit of a dip over here too. But I'm going to do less of a shadow because it's on the side of the highlight, so you have that eye right there. And then you have that dip coming in. And then I'm going to do some shadowing here where we have some bumps happening. So anytime you have a bump, there'd be a shadow to accompany that. And this would be the back side, right? Light source coming from above and to the right. So that would certainly create a little bit of a shadow. I'm going to have some shadowing here. So that comes down. Delineation of change. Same thing. Being mindful of my line directions. Okay. And then we have, some bumps here. Not nearly as extreme. Some bumps here. Do a little bit of shadowing, but not a lot. Okay. Now the rest of this should be highlight. I actually think we're starting to get the feel for our little friend. Now, as we're coming in here, I need to be careful, putting in a little bit more pin pressure, but I don't want to do so much that I disrupt the shadows, right? So certainly a little bit more pin pressure, not full blast, especially as we ram into the shadows. That's important. And then I can brighten up in between. Because the more pin pressure I put, the thicker my brush gets, and it'll make it harder to blend it together. So if I keep my pin pressure backed off and only increase it a little bit, then I can increase it more on the edges as we come away. Probably going to have a little bit of shadowing by the eye. I imagine there's some dipping in here that's happening. I could be wrong, but I feel like that would make sense. So we're gonna shadow by the eye, and I'm gonna do that real fast before I forget to do it. Oh, and I need to be careful. You can see I'm turning the wrong way, so when I get down here, it's gonna be a problem. It's the trick of not sketching it first and just jumping in. Is sometimes you gotta watch yourself. I'm making mistakes. Right, okay. Did do highlight with the yellow, so this might change a bit of what I'm doing, but we'll see. Okay, and then, right, back to what we were doing. So that faded pin pressure, it's going to be a little bit brighter, but I need to work into that. Right, so bringing that over, a little bit brighter, being mindful of where that shadow would be. Anywhere where there's already highlight, it's fine to push a little bit more, but if you're running into shadow, back off your pin pressure, and it'll help with your brush size to keep it from overwhelming a shadowed section. Right, and then we're doing the same thing through here. We're kind of running a little bit into highlight and shadow. So if we pop that off, you know, you can kind of see how his antenna's casting that shadow. And then of course the antenna itself would do the same thing. You're going to have highlighting, and you don't have to put a lot of pin pressure because we've already done that. Weighting the highlight on the side of, you know, the light source. And fading that off. Now the light source is in front of, right, so you might have a little bit where, you know, you have just like here I did where there's, you know, if I take that off, you can kind of see there's a line. It's not very noticeable. You can kind of see where there's a gap here and there shouldn't be. So it won't be extremely noticeable, but otherwise it's going to be highlight. Alright, so you have that, which we'll bring straight down. Being careful to blend this in. A couple things happening here. But just the act of stopping the brush strokes will create sort of a delineation. It's interesting how we can kind of make that happen. Right, so I'm going to bring that all the way over. Now I am pushing a little bit more, full pin pressure. And then we'll just sort of, as we bring that down, we have that little bit of shadowing. That'll be happening, right? And you can clearly see where that antenna is, and we can change how that's looking if we need to. If it's too much or too little or too over, I can shift it, you know, like we have some wiggle room here. While still leaving that hint there, because it's highlights and shadows, and this is why highlights and shadows will delineate what's happening and how it's happening and how we're perceiving it, because we're just illusionists. So creating that illusion, crafting it well. All right, so we bring this down, right, full pin pressure over here next to our little yellow friend. Oh, that's full pin pressure. We're going to back that off though as we come over, because there's that little bit of shadowing on this side. So backing off that pin pressure, a little easier to blend in when you're doing side to side like this than when you're going up and down. When you're going up and down, that blending is not something that I find to be very, not hard, it's just kind of a little bit more tedious. It's maybe the word I'm looking for. A little bit more frustrating to do. Right, so putting that full pin pressure, and then bringing that over and backing it off. And then, you know, we're going to do the same thing here. We have just a little bit of that full pin pressure, but kind of running it into shadow, so being mindful of that and careful to back off where we need to. That's why sometimes it's easier to do something all in shadow, especially when you're not looking at a big space, because you can keep your brush strokes small, right? And you get kind of the sense that there's a delineation On the lines, I don't typically, at this point, because I typically will do a sketch first, I don't usually have the lines on when I'm doing highlights and shadows, so there'll be some gaps that I'll have to fix. But you get the sense that there's bumps and there's other things happening here, which is important for a critter like a praying mantis, where that is in fact true. Alright, so then we have some highlight down here, running into shadow, being mindful again, changing my direction because of how I did it, right? So this is a case where probably didn't make the best decisions on the direction I was drawing to reconcile properly. So now I'm going to have to curve it, which is fine. It's just something I need to be mindful of, or I will run into issues later down the line. Right, so we're just curving it. It's fine. Give it a little bit of a highlight. I want it to match that yellow. A little bit of a highlight down this middle here before it sinks behind or in front of anything. Okay. Same thing over here. This is a small space, so sometimes that's easier to do, which is why I'm doing it first. Usually I do hard things first, but you know. Okay. Now, same thing we did before, right? Gentle pin pressure, a little bit heavier than the base, but still gentle. Add more lines to brighten it up, and I can push that highlight if I need to, right? I can boss this around just a bit. Gentle, brightening it up a little bit, and using my pen strokes to help me out. The amount of pen strokes, not the pressure. Same thing. Now that we're on this side. Being careful around the edges. Some of this will change as this edge will change when I pop the sketch layer off, likely. Right. But we do want this to have some semblance of normal line in. Right, I don't want this to be clearly obvious that we're going from highlight to shadow. You want it to blend nicely if you can. Yeah, see there's a gap, so we don't want that. So I'll push that highlight all the way over and down, following our little antenna down. Because we shadowed that, it'll make that antenna stand out even more, which is good. But we don't want that to be obvious, so we're see, now we have an antenna. Alright, I'm gonna fix the back side of this a little bit. As I pull out and I look at it, it irritates me. But if I do that, I need to fix this too, right? It's okay to be a little fuzzy around the edges when you have a shadow coming off. I feel like that's just a little too deep for his antenna. Yeah, that's looking better. A little bit more like a antenna instead of a giant blotch. And then we have that coming all the way. And of course we have the highlight on this guy as well. Leaving that little bit of a gap, right, as we bring it over. And then allowing that to taper. So brightening that up, bringing it over. Oh, that was a little too much. Getting overzealous with my highlights. Sometimes that's easy to do. Right, I'm making sure I'm bringing this down. Also making sure that I'm leaving that shadow on that back side. And then, you know, resuming this down. Keeping that backed off to connect in to the shadow underneath, but we're gonna be brightening this up as soon as we do this. Leaving the lines off for now because I know that this isn't running into anything important. We'll get around this antenna and fix that. Right, so then you have that brightened up right through here. And then we'll bridge the gap. So I can create that shadowing. There's going to be the highlight where the bump is, right? There's that bump in his head, but oh yeah. I'm going to do all of this first, and then we can indicate that. Sometimes it's just easier. And with highlights, it's easier to readjust, like especially if you've done a line conflict or you've accidentally created something in the wrong spot. It's easier to fix something in a highlight. The shadows, when you're backing off your pin pressure, are a little less forgiving because you're not putting as many lines. So the lines you put need to be a little bit more important. But his forehead mostly, except, you know, where we have his antenna, it's going to be in shadow. I think you can really kind of start seeing this here. Okay, so now I'm going to need you because I need this to bump up. Right, so we're going to have this little section here that's running into shadow where he's got just a little bit of a bump. Have that come down a bit and go into shadow just underneath. And then otherwise, creating highlight, being careful on those edges, right? And once we're in the thick of it, it's okay to put full pin pressure or more pin pressure, but on those edges, you really got to back off and allow more pin pressure to work for you. We're not going to make this as deep of a shadow on this bump as we did with the antenna, so that's important too. So running some lines up to it, and then where I need to, I can cross over if I think it's too dull or, you know, too much in shadow. I can add, you know, the deeper the shadow, the deeper the chasm, or the deeper the object, the bigger the object that's casting the shadow. Or so, you know, if you want to make it seem like it's smaller, you just add a little bit more highlighting to it, and you'll make it seem smaller and smaller or less significant while still maintaining that it's there. So full control, it's just a little easier to do when you're not putting that full pin pressure, right? And it's not a very big bump in his face. And then underneath it, same thing. Again, not very big, so we don't want to do a whole lot. But we've done some, so that should be a good indication that it's there, right? You can kind of see it. And then I can fiddle with it until I think it looks like a decent, like, oh, it's barely there. There's like a thing happening, right? And you can pull back and you can kind of see it adds just that little bit of bumpiness without being an overwhelming, like, spot. That's exactly what you want. I'm just going to get rid of some of these dips where it looks like he's got extra spots that are dipping in his face. Okay. And then the other thing, you know, you can see here it's very faded where his antenna's coming off, so we're going to fade this a little bit more. It's there, but shouldn't have a nice clean edge. Should be a little bit more splotchy. Now we have by his eye over here. So right, same thing on this side that we did on the other. But we'll need to fix what's happening here, yeah. But some of what helps create that sense of three-dimensionality, right, is you have a shadow. That shadow of the antenna all the way around with a deeper shadow on the back side that runs straight into highlight, which tells us light source is hitting right hard against here because the object is projecting the shadow against and away from that highlight, which is on this back side. And so you have that highlight running into that little bit of a shadow as it rounds away, and as we pull back, that's what's going to add to that sense that it's three-dimensional. Right, and I can see eye over here I feel like would be highlight, because you've got that, you know, if there's a ridge, that little bit of a dip on the one side, then the opposite would be true on this one. You have that same dip, but now it's facing towards the light source, so that would be full pin pressure. Being mindful of that top transition, right, as we bring it down, and then brightening it up. So we're starting to get a sense for that look. It'll look a lot different as we add in all the green in between, but starting to get a sense for how this little fella's looking. Backing off just a little bit where it's mixing into that spot that's a little more, and then being careful, right? I almost followed the eye around. Easy to do, but I need to start looping this in like I did over here, because I'm going to need this to be coming out at a certain angle. So I need these two to meet in the middle, or I'll have some line conflicts. So just like we did on one side, have to be mindful on the other as well. Eye is typically a place where you need to be careful. I would say that's true here as well, but because of how we're going to draw the eyes, there might be some manner of not needing that to be as perfect as usual. Right, backing off because we're running into some areas that are shadowed. You have all of this going down here. And of course, all of this as it comes in. Being careful. Still connecting it in. You can see that green and that yellow pretty close together, which is kind of how it is. It's hard to see that difference on a praying mantis. And again, I don't think all of them have that distinction, but it wouldn't be entirely easy or obvious to see. All right, being careful over here as we come out. Otherwise, we have highlight blending into shadow, right? So we have to blend that nicely, but otherwise it's going to be full pin pressure against that yellow. I don't want specific like full gaps, but... And then up here, right, we're coming down. And you can see the color change to the yellow. Right? But it is a lot harder. I'll take that off for now. I think that's just getting in my way. And that full pin pressure, just sort of working it up to make sure that little bit of a ridge remains in shadow. We'll see how that works when we're done, if I need to brighten that up or not. And then pull it down. The yellow is going to do a pretty good job of delineating the spaces for us. Well, I say that, but the green and the yellow are pretty close in their values, so that might not be as obvious as I would think. But we'll see. We'll see. And save often. You don't want to lose all the work you've done. Very frustrating. Just had it happen a couple weeks ago when I was drawing the stellar sea eagle. lost a chunk of work because Photoshop froze on me. And that is very, very sad. Okay, so I'm going to finish all the green in this section up here, and I'll be right back. All right. So he's looking good. You can kind of see, you know, like I don't want this to be as deep. So this is a case where I'm going to take very light pen pressure and just lightly go over it. Direction I've already drawn. It's going to brighten it up and dull out that shadow so it doesn't seem nearly as deep or prominent on his face. It's just that little bit too much. See, that does a lot to fix. It's looking a little bit malaligned. Now we have what's going on down here. Right, same thing, running into shadow, so allowing that to be shadowy so that you can then put more pen pressure and more lines to try and brighten it up. But I don't want that to be a distinctive line from the brightness of the yellow to the brightness of the green. It should be a consistent line through there. And then, right, we have a couple of shadowed areas on this back side here where it's connecting into both. And then just making sure we can blend it in. And bring that down. And then we run into an area that's going to be highlight. So rest of this over here, highlight. And we'll do the same thing on the other side, and then we have the middle. So just bring it over and blending it in. Backing off that pin pressure, turning it into more lines, especially as we start tucking it over here. Right, and you get kind of that pattern on the face where we can change how deep something is, right? So that's a little too much. But we'll leave the other one. Change this a little bit too. It's all done through shadows and highlights to bring off the deepness of some of these. Same thing on this side, right? Except this is the shadowed side, so some of these bumps might appear a little bit more strong on that back side. But we're running into some highlight here. So we come against his, I don't know, pincer. Very certain it's not called a pincer, but purposes of this video, that might be what it remains for the duration. And then up in here, right, same thing, have that shadow going, that light pin pressure. Give ourselves room to work. Okay, and then it's full pin pressure. Well, I guess some light pin pressure through here too. Almost full pin pressure. Right against the yellow, there's going to be that full highlight that fades into that shadow. Now, we have full pin pressure here in the middle, but as we get closer to the edges, we need to blend it. I'm coming over here to some shadow so we can use the lines instead to help us, and as we pull away we can put more and more pressure to do that for us. And same thing. Full pin pressure otherwise though, right? But I'm running right up to it and then adding these more lines, pulling away and then putting more pin pressure. It needs to be right up against that yellow. So when we pull back, you have a harsher shadow over there, but you get kind of that same I'm just going to say design look, the way that the face is sort of bending, the bump, I don't know. You have that mirrored look on one side and the other. Just to bring it out a little bit, but I don't want to timber it out too much. Get this little bit here, going into full highlight down in here against his tentacle, pincer thing. All right, then we're straight up and down. Here, kind of the same thing. And we're straight up and down as we blend the two together. That would be full highlight. And making sure that they're properly blended together. No big obvious gaps anywhere. Okay, so the rest of this green here is going to be full pin pressure. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this in and I'll be right back. So I'm going to get the antennas done. And then, you know, his little things, and then his eyes. I'm going to start a new layer for the antennas just in case. So they're pretty small and thin. And I didn't draw them very straight. So I'm going to kind of do them in shadow first because there's not like a lot of room. So just that light pin pressure. Trying to make sure I don't make it too thick in places like I did in the sketch. But, and then the tips of them, so they're green like the praying mantis, but the tips are going to be that same brown that the, well, either the eyes or the little things. All right, need this off. Okay. So, first things first, right? This needs to be as thick as the gap I left. So when we add highlights to this, it should really help to flesh that out. And then just gonna kind of carefully smooth out all the other rough edges. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, and then we'll add highlights to it. Doesn't have to be perfect, but straighter than how I sketched it for sure. Alright, so you have a pretty big twist here. So some of it's just straightening out lines, evening it up. Man, that was really hard to say. Words are hard. Alright. Keep doing that. Now that I've almost got this sketched in, we'll add the pin pressure for the highlight kind of in the middle, but leaning more towards the side the highlight would be on, although that's hard to distinguish on a space so small sometimes, so it might look like it's in the middle. Plus I'm fixing any gaps as I see them. And then we'll need to make sure that's nice and faded out, right? So we'll bring this down. That'll help it pop too, because right now it's fading, right? And it'll come down here and it'll be more of a brighter pop into the head. Make the antenna look like it's part of the composition, right? And then just fade it in. Making sure there's no big gaps. Same thing on this side, right? Putting that kind of in between with fading it out. Sometimes aiming my pin in the right spot is a little off. Same thing, right? Bringing that down, and that should help brighten up and make it clear that this is going into the top of his little antenna. All right. Oh yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. These are similar but not quite, in that the antennae are a little bit more straight. These don't have to be nearly as straight, but there's some amount of like I can't have a straight line going crazy. And they're kind of in segments. So you have all these kind of individual segments. You know, just like you see in a lot of insects. I was almost going to call them fangs. They're not fangs here. They're, I don't know what they are. These things. Almost makes it easier too, because they don't have to be right. I don't have to make this whole thing straight because it's not, so it's okay to be a little off. So once again though, because we're dealing with a small space, I'm drawing all of this in shadow first, because it'll be easier to deal with adding highlight once we add the shadow in, because it is such a tight space. And some of them, particularly the ones coming from underneath, will likely have a significant chunk in shadow. So just that light pin pressure. Just making sure the edges line up as we bring it around. Luckily it kind of peeks out on one side. Okay, so just like before though, now I need to see what I've done. Yeah, you can see the gaps there. I was fully expecting that to happen. So I'm going to fix some of this, because this is coming out from under. These two are going to have more shadows on them than the other. And then of course fix how this kind of lines in. You know, making sure any of those black spots are fully filled in. For the most part it's just some small detailing. And on this case, on the side that is against his face, like it's okay to go a little off. We won't necessarily notice that because using light pin pressure, so we won't notice if we push into where the face is. If we were using full pin pressure, maybe. Okay, so now we are going to add those highlights after I fill in one other gap. So it's going to be weighted more towards the top, right up here, than underneath, but still kind of in that middle. So once again, we're dealing with very little space. I'll do it for every segment, making sure to try and line them up exactly where the others are. Although there's already pretty heavy weighted highlight there. And then it's kind of, right, the tip is going away from the light source. So have it kind of bend away. Same thing over here, right? This is pushing a little bit in front of the face, just like the other side was. This is pushing a little bit forward. And the two underneath are coming from underneath, right? So they're not quite doing that, but same thing. You have that come in, then you're going to have another segment. And then down here, final piece. Probably going to give a little bit, but not much, because it's dealing with a lot of shadow where it is. And not be as bad with what I just did. I was just trying to bring this down a bit. going underneath, so I want that to be clear. I can do a little bit, but otherwise not so much. Maybe the same here, just a little bit, kind of where it's poking out, but otherwise not so much. Okay. Now, for the eyes. He's got some hair on him, but we can worry about that later. Okay. So the eyes, what we're going to do, just making sure and double checking I'm on the right layer. We're going to take our brush and we're going to go in two opposite directions, basically drawing in almost a crosshatch style, but creating that crisscross. You see that a lot in bug's eyes. It's a good detail to add. So choose one direction, and we'll mirror it on the other side. And just because of how we sketch, it'll create the natural crosshatch of the eye. The only problem being is we're coming up to the edge instead of being able to nicely round it out, although I'm twisting it a little bit. Right, so I'm going to fill this in shadow completely with the eye, going in one direction, and then I'll do it the other. So I'm going to get one direction. I'll be back in just a moment. All right. So that's kind of how it looks. That's one direction. So now we're going to go in another direction, trying to make an X with it. So now it would be more this way, right? So same thing. I'm going to sketch it all the way in, but because we're going now in a different direction, it'll create that X-like pattern to the eyes. And when we highlight it, we'll do the same thing, mindful to create that X-like pattern with the eyes. But still that light pin pressure, it's brightening it up significantly because now I'm adding more strokes, and I'm adding strokes on a different axis. So it'll create a brighter look, but all of this is that light pin pressure. And you can kind of see what that's doing. So I'm going to do this on both sides, and then I will be right back. Now I'm just going to fix some of the rough edges. So some of them go outside. Just debating on if I should worry about it. Some of them though are pretty extremely outside the others, and I need to make sure this tips off. Refining the lines as much as I can, given how it's drawn. Right, making sure it's a cleaner edge than what it currently is. So just doing that creates a lot of texture. Just going to take that out. That's a little extreme. And I'm going to take that out because that's also a little extreme. Okay. Now there would be highlight here, right? So light source coming from above and to the right. So first bit of highlight, I am putting a little bit more pin pressure, but not a lot, because I don't want to disrupt how it's going to look. So first bit of highlight up and to the right, and blending it in. And we'll do it on that cross axis too. All edges are in shadow, so we just did the shadow, which means I don't have to worry about pushing to the edge anymore. Just need to worry about making sure the highlight ends up in the right spot and that it looks rounded. That's helpful when you're doing more lines instead of more pressure, because the edges, as naturally as we're pulling away with less pin pressure, just adding in more lines, we're not creating a thicker line, we're creating that nice tapered edge. All right, just bringing it down. Oh, that was a little much. Yeah. It was already a bright line, that's why that built up a little quicker. It's okay to have some deviation, but sometimes it's a little much. And then we'll do the same opposite way. Kind of already defined that edge, so. Right, so you get, you know, a nice highlight there. Now on this one it's going to be, right, this is more weighted this way, this one's weighted this way. So focusing on that highlight, not towards the edge of the eye over here, that would be slipping into shadow, but towards the inner part of the eye. Just like we're dealing with a ball stuck in an object. That's exactly how we're going to think about it and shadow it. But careful to leave, that might have been too much. It is stuck into the object itself, right? So there would be a bit of shadowing right against that, the edge where it's going into the head of Mantis. Otherwise, like a ball, as we bring it down. Being mindful, the reason we're doing this, right, light sources above and to the right, so that's dictating the direction these highlights are. Tapering it off just like we did before. And then, once again, let's bring this a little bit more in. Going on that other edge, doing the same thing in an area now that we've defined. Adding in those extra lines to create the highlight. But not necessarily extra pin pressure because we won't need it. Just making sure that this is a cleaner edge, a smooth transition. So this should look nice and 3D-esque by the time we're done. And if it's not, we can make changes as we need to. All right, and tapering that off as we get to the edge of our highlighted section, but making sure it's nice and smooth. Pushing this in just a little bit. And then letting it off at the bottom. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Now I am actually going to take some green, which I kind of half decided on. I was torn between making the eyes green or brown. It's a praying mantis, so it could be either. I'm going to see what it looks like to add a little bit of green on top. Not much, but, you know, just a little bit on some of this highlight. It'll make it more of a brownish green instead of just this solid brown. And potentially give it more of that kind of weird bug-like look that they have, that bug's eyes can get. Dipping a little past the highlight, I'm also going to do it right against the head. Right, so we'll do just a little bit. Swoop. Right against the head. Like greenness. And then on this side, and we'll do that crosshatch as well. So it's still this light pin pressure. I'm not putting a ton of pressure as I do this. But even though I've done the eyes in brown, this should give it that, you know, mantis look. Their eyes can be brown, so it's not so unusual to do that, but I feel like this will help temper that a bit, make it seem more praying mantis, right? But not pushing it all the way to the edge, so I'm still relegating it mostly to that highlight. I'll push it in towards the body, right, sooner than I push it out towards the edge. That edge as that goes into shadow, this will just be another poignant way to do that. And then we do that crosshatch. Same thing over here, now we do that crosshatch. Help add to that illusion that their eyes have that texture to them. I'm just trying to balance them both out. You know, sometimes I get overzealous, too overzealous on one side, and I have to balance it out. That's why it's important to back away. Sometimes they don't notice. Now, last thing I'm actually going to do here is come in and use the elliptical marquee tool to erase out some of their eye. Let's see what I got here. I'm actually going to make a copy of all these later, so I'm going to do that by grabbing the layer, dragging it down. This is just to make sure if I don't like it, I can undo this easily. Although I could just hit undo. I'm going to do it this way anyway. I'm going to erase, erase, erase. And then I'm going to drag the selection, so I'm going to leave it on the elliptical marquee tool, drag the selection to the other side, to the other eye, where I've drawn this out. See if I can line that up. And do the same thing, erase, erase, erase. And then, yeah. It looks like it's looking at you. Probably going to fix this little bit of a corner up. Just checking to see if there's any other corners that need it, because this is looking a little rough. I'm going to do that by starting another layer. Alright, so I just want to make sure this is nice and smooth. Can do some bending of that edge as I need to. I mean, I want it in shadow, but don't want it to look too jagged. See, that looks much smoother. Likewise, up here, there's some of that happening too. Can manipulate some of these lines just a bit, right, to give them that edge. And then run the other side up to them. And I probably could leave this be, but I'm not going to. Yeah. There we go. And the last thing I forgot to do, I'm going to take this color and finish out the tips of his antenna. Following that same highlighting pattern, being mindful of the light source. And I might take, I'm going to see how this looks. If I take a little bit of white, I can add just a little burst of highlight. Doesn't have to be much. Just along that axis, right? And do the crosshatch. Doesn't have to be much. Probably should have done this before I erased out the pupil, but that's okay. Same thing on both sides, not much, just enough pushing into the eye, just that little bit, without actually pushing into the eye, pushing into the pupil. Oh, and then not making up your own line just because you don't want to draw the other one. Alright, so same thing. It's not much. I'm, again, really holding back my pin pressure here. Being careful by the eye. Alright, that gives it just that little bit of extra. So it's not a lot, but it certainly is enough. And then I'm just going to snip some of the white I pushed too much. Okay, there we go. Nice big praying mantis head. Alright, so that's how you draw a praying mantis. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done. I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.